We'll be discussing the Islamic view of slavery quite a bit in the coming weeks, but when I go through the Muslim sources, I tend to quote passages pretty quickly without unpacking everything that could be unpacked. In this video, I wanted to take a close look at a hadith that I've quoted before and will quote again, just so you can see how much we can learn from a single hadith. Synen number 4625. It was narrated that Jabir said, "A slave came and gave his pledge to the Messenger of Allah to emigrate, and the Prophet did not realize that he was a slave. Then his master came looking for him. The Prophet said, 'Sell him to me.' So he bought him for 2 black slaves. Then he did not accept the pledge of anyone after that until he had asked, 'Is he a slave?'" Now, watch how many things we can learn about the Islamic view of slaves from this one passage. First, the heading says that this hadith is about selling animals for different animals of different amounts or quality. Nasai is considered one of the greatest hadith collectors of all time. He knew the history of Muhammad and his companions inside and out, and his scholarly conclusion was that slaves are on the same level as animals. Second, this edition of Sunan an-Nasai is published by Darussalam, which is a Saudi publisher. Notice that neither the translators nor the publishers make any attempt to conceal the fact that slaves were viewed as animals. Perfectly acceptable view in Saudi Arabia. Third, this hadith says that a slave came to Muhammad and pledged to leave his home and join the Muslim community. Muhammad accepted the pledge, but only because he didn't realize that the man was a slave. In other words, Muhammad didn't know that accepting this man's pledge was going to cost him something. Muhammad learned his lesson from this situation, and the passage says that after this, Muhammad would no longer accept the pledge from anyone until he asked, "Is he a slave?" So Muhammad really didn't want to have to pay to free Muslim slaves who were converting to Islam. Now, to be fair, it is considered a good deed in Islam to free Muslim slaves. But Muhammad just didn't want to keep paying out of pocket, so he decided to be more careful to ask whether they were slaves before accepting pledges from them. Fourth, Muhammad owned black slaves. If he bought a slave with 2 black slaves, he obviously had black slaves. And we've seen in other videos that Muhammad had numerous black slaves. The Prophet of Islam bought, sold, and traded black African slaves. Muhammad could have bought the slave with money, but he bought him with black slaves. Black slaves were a form of currency for Muhammad and his companions. Fifth, the slave who made a pledge to Muhammad was an Arab slave, and Muhammad traded 2 black slaves for 1 Arab slave, suggesting that black slaves were considered less valuable and were therefore cheaper than Arab slaves. Hence the heading, "Selling animals for different animals of different amounts or quality." So, in Islam, slaves are comparable to animals, and black slaves were worth less than non-black slaves. How did these ideas become entrenched in Islam? To answer this question, we have to take a close look at Muhammad himself by watching this video, Muhammad, the White Prophet with Black Slaves. I also recommend taking a screenshot of the hadith we just examined and sharing it until people finally realize that a Muslim preacher claiming that Islam is a religion of liberation and racial equality in order to win converts tells us next to nothing about what we'll find in Islam's most trusted sources.